Hello, and welcome to Best Practices in ESOL Instruction based on the Massachusetts Professional Standards for Adult ESOL, Standard 6, Instructional Delivery. The Mass ESOL Professional Standards clarify what teachers of adult ESOL should know and be able to do to be effective in their instruction. They include knowing and applying principles of second language acquisition, that is, knowing how second languages are learned and how they are best taught. Knowing the components of the English language, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, etc., and more importantly, how to teach them effectively. Knowing how to approach teaching in a culturally responsive way and sustaining that approach over time. How to design thoughtful, coherent, standards-based curriculum and instructional plans. Knowing about various assessments and how to implement them, and how to have ownership of one's professional growth. All of these standards are centered around the instructional delivery, Standard 6. That is, it is in the classroom, remote, in-person, or hybrid, that all of the standards for effective ESOL instruction are applied and put into action. And that is what we are going to talk about today. What are your best practices in ESOL instruction? As a teacher or student, you undoubtedly have some ideas. What has worked for you in the adult ESOL class? What has worked for you as a second language learner? What do you think about when you're planning an ESOL lesson? And what are some practices you routinely do to ensure that your students are learning? Take a moment to think about them and jot them down. Did your responses include some of these same points? Making lessons interactive and relevant. Balancing instruction and practice. Is your instruction at the appropriate level? Is it challenging but not too challenging? Are you seeing progress and ensuring that your lessons are student-centered? Is your instruction encouraging and respectful of your students? Mass ESOL Professional Standard 6, Instructional Delivery, captures all of that. The standard is based on the research that has found that adults' second language acquisition is enhanced by use of a variety of rigorous instructional methods and relevant materials that optimize student engagement, encourage productive struggle, foster critical thinking, and address the diverse needs, interests, and levels of readiness. Another way to look at these best practices is through this frame, which places all of the elements mentioned thus far into one of these three categories: relevant and inclusive, engaging and interactive, and rigorous. By which we mean it is culturally responsive and contextualized and meaningful, authentic content. It includes opportunities for learners to communicate and collaborate with one another, when they, not the teacher, do most of the talking, and when they are free to make mistakes that are corrected judiciously. And rigorous instruction promotes critical thinking, is accessible to all learners. It gradually releases responsibility for learning to the learners, and it includes regular assessment of learning that is communicated to the students. Let's take a closer look at each of these practices. How do effective ESOL teachers create a classroom environment that is relevant and inclusive? They get to know their students as individuals and create opportunities for classmates to get to know each other. There are many ways to do this: during intake or through informal conversations before, during, and after class, through individual interviews with students, or through their written responses to questions. Effective teachers ask students about their lives, their countries of origin and educational backgrounds, their cultures, as well as their current work and family situations, their communities, their interests, and their goals. They also integrate community building into class time. A unit early on in the year, for example, can focus specifically on community building, through which learners share and gather information with and about their classmates, while also developing their language skills. English learners at all levels can learn and practice asking and answering questions, talking about jobs and their neighborhoods, describing their lives. They can write about themselves and about their classmates, give a presentation to the class, and listen to their classmates' presentations as well. Teachers use this information to inform what they're going to teach and the materials that they're going to use. They use information they've gathered about their students to help identify class topics, set unit and lesson goals and objectives, and select materials that reflect the diversity of the learners, including authors and presenters that represent the learners' various cultures. This allows for instruction in which language skills are contextualized in content that is meaningful and authentic to students. For example, after learning about a student's goals and interests, a teacher might develop a unit or lesson that focuses on career exploration, or on exploring and solving a problem in their community, or on the current events going on in their countries of origin. The possibilities are as diverse as our learners. Finally, effective teachers give students a choice and a voice in their class by involving them in decision-making about, for example, allowing students to choose their own research topics and how they want to present the results, including them in establishing class routines and guidelines, inviting students to bring in reading materials or videos that they want to read or watch, or websites they want to explore, or materials that they themselves have created, and checking in with students regularly for feedback on how the class is going for them and welcoming their suggestions. Do they want more time practicing or interacting? Do they want direct instruction or teacher explanations? Do they want more or less homework? Adult learning theory tells us that adults learn best when they have a clear purpose to their learning, when it is relevant and applicable to their lives, and when they are respected as adults. Furthermore, a key principle of second language acquisition is that it is more successful when students are in a comfortable, supportive learning environment. That is why it is so important to create a relevant and inclusive learning in the adult ESOL class. Another important SLA principle is that language acquisition is facilitated when learners are engaged in interacting with one another. What do effective ESOL teachers do to ensure this is happening? They provide communicative, collaborative learning opportunities for their students. They limit their teacher talk to make room for students to talk. They modify their teacher talk so that it is comprehensible to the language learners. They provide corrective feedback judiciously. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's look at each of these practices more closely. To provide communicative, collaborative learning opportunities, effective teachers plan ahead. Their lesson plans are intentional and explicit about what the student will be doing and what the teacher will be doing. They identify the language that the students will need to practice in order to meet the objectives of the lesson, and depending on the objectives, they plan paired or small group activities through which students will ask each other questions or role play, discuss a reading, or puzzle out a problem together. They integrate all language skills into these activities, so if, for example, the objectives are that learners will be able to write a letter to a newspaper editor, then the activities and tasks would involve writing, perhaps having students share their drafts and receiving peer feedback, or collaborating on a written piece in a shared Google document. If the objectives include comprehending a complex reading, then the class activities will involve reading. Reading tasks can be made interactive through a jigsaw activity in which students must talk to each other to get the complete text, or through practicing and discussing some pre- or post-reading strategies. Teachers facilitate student interaction by providing support and encouragement as needed, guiding them to stay on task, and informally assessing progress in areas that are posing a challenge. It is also helpful to students for teachers to be transparent about the purpose and value of these interactive activities, and explain that the more they practice and use the language, the more language they will acquire and the faster they'll acquire it. This information fosters students' metacognitive awareness or understanding of how they learn and what facilitates their learning. To promote learner engagement and interaction, it is also really important for teachers to be aware of how much talking they're doing at the expense of their students. There's only so much time in class, and every time a teacher is talking, that is one less opportunity for a student to talk. So effective teachers limit the time they're talking to about 20%, leaving the remaining 80% for students to talk. This isn't so easy to do, so effective teachers will carefully monitor how much they're talking, maybe even asking a colleague to observe them or recording one of their classes. They practice wait time. They consciously and intentionally do not talk. They wait long enough for students to formulate responses, sometimes having to tolerate awkward silences. This can be a challenge, but one worth meeting. In this exchange, the teacher uses wait time while the student considers his response to the question, "Where did you go yesterday?" Once the student has had time to consider, they reply, "I went to the store yesterday." They ask students open-ended questions and invite them to elaborate to say more. Here you see the teacher asking the student an open-ended question. "Tell me what you think about the stores here in the U.S." The teacher then waits for the response as the student considers. And the student replies that the stores are large and busy. To encourage more speaking from his student, the teacher will ask follow-up questions such as, "Which store do you like best?" Again, providing time for the student to think about how to respond, and allowing the student the opportunity to say that they like Target the best. They prompt further language use and discussion by saying, "Can you tell me more?" And teachers can expand the role of students by asking a student, as you see here, to explain something to the class, or teach something, or to respond to their classmates' questions, or even write on the board. When teachers do speak, they make sure to do so in a way their learners can understand. Another key principle of second language acquisition is the concept of comprehensible input, which means simply that language acquisition is facilitated when learners are hearing or reading language that is at or just above their proficiency level. So effective teachers adjust their language to the level of students, using appropriate vocabulary, grammar, and structure. They avoid using idioms and figures of speech. They enunciate clearly, and they use gestures and body language as well as facial expressions. Effective ESOL teachers will also speak slowly without sounding artificial or condescending to their adult learners, finding that balance of speaking naturally in a manner that their students can understand. A final way that teachers encourage student engagement and interaction is by not overdoing the error correction, but instead providing corrective feedback in a judicious manner. Effective teachers know that making mistakes is a natural and necessary part of language learning, and they make it clear to students that they should feel comfortable making them. They also know that it is important for learners to engage in productive struggle, where the learners actively monitor their own language, notice communication breakdowns, and work to figure things out. It is not always useful for the teacher to give the right answer. And it is not always helpful to correct a student in the moment. For example, when the goal of an activity or task is communication, not accuracy, and the student's errors do not interfere with communication. Or when the teacher does not want to interrupt a student out of respect. Or when they want to encourage fluency and confidence. In these instances, what effective teachers do is listen for recurring errors, jot them down, and prepare lessons to address them at a later time. But sometimes, of course, corrective feedback is necessary. For example, when the errors interfere with communication. In these cases, teachers and students often engage in an authentic back and forth, trying to figure out what the student is trying to communicate or to negotiate meaning. Effective teachers make use of these teachable moments. Other times, accuracy is the goal of a lesson or the focus of a class activity. In these instances, it is necessary to provide corrective feedback. And of course, if students are preparing for college or the workplace, then accuracy, particularly in writing, matters. So, what is the most effective way to provide corrective feedback? There are several effective techniques teachers can use. They can explicitly point out the error and correct it. For example, when a student says, "I go to work yesterday," the teacher might simply and directly say, "You went yesterday." But teachers can also provide corrective feedback implicitly by recasting or restating correctly. What happened after you went to work? Or by drawing the student's attention to the error but not necessarily correcting it. You go yesterday? A general rule of thumb is to give students the opportunity to notice the error themselves and to self-correct before jumping in with the correct form. Effective teachers, therefore, teach language learners how to monitor their own speech and writing to self-assess and self-correct. And depending on the level, interest, and goals of the students, teachers may also provide metalinguistic feedback by naming the error to use a grammatical term. Remember, went is the past tense of the verb to go. The key is to choose and provide corrective feedback judiciously in order to promote learner self-awareness and independence, and to encourage them to practice and use the language, even if it means making mistakes. The third and final area of ESOL instruction we'd like to discuss is rigor. We know that adult English learners need to acquire the language not simply to survive in the U.S., but to thrive here, to communicate and participate fully in the workplace, in post-secondary education, and in social and civic life. So effective teachers provide rigorous English language instruction to prepare them by promoting critical thinking, ensuring that all learners can access the rigorous content and activities, by fostering learner independence by gradually releasing responsibility for learning to the learners, and by regularly assessing learners, checking for understanding before moving on. Let's take a closer look at each of these instructional practices. To promote critical thinking, effective teachers contextualize language learning in content and activities that require learners to consider complex ideas, to read or listen to complex informational texts, to argue a position or point of view citing evidence from a text, to critically analyze and assess an author's point of view, and to solve problems. It is not simply contextualizing language in areas such as shopping or healthcare or community services, but rather contextualizing language in rich tasks such as analyzing the nutritional value of various foods, or researching food deserts in low-income neighborhoods, comparing and evaluating different health insurance plans, or making evidence-based argument on a socio-political issue. To ensure that all learners can access these kinds of rigorous content and activities, effective teachers provide scaffolding or supports, such as a reading guide to accompany a complex text, sentence stems for help with writing or talking about complex ideas, or closed captioning for videos. They differentiate, providing the above supports to those students who need it, or a simplified version of a text to some students, or an audio to accompany a reading for others. They explicitly teach academic and professional language to all learners, the vocabulary, as well as the sentence forms and conventions for expressing such things as research, citing resources, and making nuanced arguments. They provide background knowledge where it might be missing for someone new to the U.S., for example, pictures of places that are referred to in a reading, Midwestern Plains or Las Vegas, or a cultural reference like from The Wizard of Oz, for example. They may also take students on a field trip at the beginning of a unit, for example, to the community college or local library, so that students have a visual image, such as a point of reference, to access new information. Occasionally, it is acceptable and beneficial for a teacher to allow the use of a student's first language in the class. For example, when giving complicated instructions for a rigorous activity, or to translate something particularly challenging to understand. When providing rigorous instruction, effective teachers gradually release responsibility for learning to the learners so that learners ultimately take ownership of their learning. The basic steps of GRR, as it is sometimes referred, are first, accessing or providing learners prior knowledge about the class topic or language focus in order to see what they already know and what they want and need to know before launching into the lesson. Then introducing the new language, information, or concept through either student exploration and discovery or some kind of presentation. There is often some direct instruction at this point. Then teachers set up and guide learners through practice activities, moving from more controlled to less controlled practice to eventually authentic use of the new language. And the ultimate goal is for learners to be able to transfer their language skills to outside of the classroom. So a culminating activity such as a role play, presentation, or written piece that approximates a real-life situation allows both teacher and student to feel confident in the student's ability to do so. While gradually releasing responsibility for learning to the learners, effective teachers check for understanding, regularly assessing learning before moving on to the next step. They ask learners for their own subjective sense of understanding. They may also ask for a more objective demonstration of learning through a short recall activity or a low-stakes quiz. They closely observe learners during practice activities to see that all are engaged and able to participate in the task. At the end of a unit, effective teachers make sure their learners can demonstrate that they have learned the goals and objectives of the unit so that when they leave the class, they will be able to transfer what they've learned to other novel situations. So, that was a lot. Let's revisit this framework that summarizes all of the best practices we've just covered. Effective ESOL instruction is relevant and inclusive, by which we mean it is culturally responsive and contextualized in authentic, meaningful content. It is engaging and interactive, wherein teachers provide learners with ample opportunities to communicate and collaborate with one another, when learners do most of the talking, not the teacher, and when students are free to make mistakes that the teacher corrects in a thoughtful and judicious manner. An effective ESOL instruction is rigorous. Teachers promote critical thinking, make the content and activities accessible to all learners, gradually release responsibility for learning to the learners, and regularly assess the learner's understanding. Through effective instructional practices such as these, ESOL teachers facilitate their students' language acquisition, accelerating their learning to provide them with the skills, strategies, and confidence to communicate in English and navigate systems outside of the classroom, in the workplace, in higher education, and in their communities. For more about effective ESOL instruction, visit the SABE's website for additional resources, research, and calendar of upcoming events on topics such as the gradual release of responsibility, promoting learner independence, ownership, and agency, differentiation by design, scaffolding in the adult ESOL classroom, project-based and problem-based learning, best practices in remote ESOL instruction for beginning English language learners, building evidence-based argumentation skills, and much more. Thank you so much for your time and attention.